Hi, I'm Marcus with the IndieMusicLab.com. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to take a vocal from sounding normal and standard like this.
It feels like I only go backwards, baby.
And I'm going to show you how to completely ruin it and transform it into a Tame Impala style psychedelic vocal mix like this.
Feels like I only go backwards, baby. Every part of me says go ahead.
So I'm going to walk you through my entire vocal chain, everything from EQ, compression, saturation, and then of course the meat of the video, which is going to be about the reverbs and the delays. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a few background vocals that I added, as well as just a couple little ear candy tricks that you can throw in as well, just for good measure. So enough messing around, let's get started. Now the song you heard at the intro when I was giving you that A-B demonstration is my remake of the song Feels Like I Only Go Backwards by Tame Impala. And that is the song that I'm going to walk you through in this video. So let's get started. I am going to focus in on this lead vocal. We're turning all the plugins off, all the reverbs, all the delays, everything. And then we are just going to start step by step and walk through this vocal chain. And I'll give you insights into my thought process, not just like what actually happened in this specific song, okay? So the first phase, because I'm going to split this up into a couple different phases. The first phase is the EQ, compression, and saturation phase. Generally speaking, you don't want to immediately go for a reverb or a delay or what other effects you might want to add. Let's get the foundation right. That's important. We want to make sure that the vocal take is good in the first place, obviously, and then we want to make sure the EQ, compression, and the saturation really build a nice, strong foundation. And then when you make that foundation strong, it's amazing how easy it becomes to get really good sounding reverbs and delays and whatever else you might want to add to it. Okay, so let's get started on this chain. Coming in at the top of this vocal chain is very simply a de-esser. So here is without that de-esser.
It feels like I only go backwards, baby. Every part of me says.
So we're just taming those S's and the sibilants here on that vocal. A de-esser is a great plugin to put at the top of a chain. I actually do recommend that just by default. Start with that, even if it's light. You can always add more de-essing later on in the chain, which actually is what happens here as well. Now, after the de-esser, we have here inside of my DAW Studio One, it's what's called the fat channel. And this is where you can apply EQ, compression, gate, a couple other things, limiter. So I mostly use this for compression and EQ. And I specifically love the fat channel because you have analog modeled compressors. Like this compressor here is an 1176 style compressor. So it's an aggressive, fast attack compressor, which I love using this type of compressor early on in a vocal chain because it just gets that vocal immediately into a nice mixed place. And then everything else becomes a good bit easier throughout the rest of the chain. So here is what is happening on this vocal.
Go ahead.
So you can see here,
I got my hopes up.
on those louder parts, it's compressing it at about -6, -7 dB here on the gain reduction meter. And then we've got attack release, pretty standard settings here. And then also I'm doing some work on the EQ just to scoop out a little bit of the low mids and to scoop out about 3 dB here, around 3K. So here is without that fat channel.
Again, oh no. Feels like we only go backwards, darling.
So as you can hear, when we are starting to build out the EQ, compression, and the saturation in the first phase of this process, you're not hearing huge differences. You're not hearing, not like what's going to happen with the reverb here in a minute, right? You're not hearing crazy transformation of the sound. A lot of this is subtlety, but man, when you do it well and you start to build these skills of using EQ, compression, and saturation well, it's amazing what can happen. Now, the next plugin then is another EQ. So we already did a bit of EQ work using that vintage style EQ in the previous plugin, but now I pulled in the stock EQ here in Studio One, the standard visual one, just to mess around a bit more. Now, a key point as to what my thought process is here. This is the point, especially where I am no longer in solo with this vocal. I am putting this vocal up against the instrumentation and I am EQing accordingly, okay? So I'm no longer using this vocal in isolation.
I only go backwards, baby.
Now, what's interesting about this EQ is in isolation, if you just solo it,
it feels like I only go backwards.
Notice when I turn the EQ off, that sounds better to me. It sounds a bit more bassy, more full, more warm. But here's the key point, guys. That's in solo. That doesn't mean squat. That doesn't matter. What matters is what does it sound like in context of the entire mix. And that is why I ended up doing a big cut here in the 500 range. This is about 4 or 5 dB, right? It's like 5 dB cut here in this low mid range. And then a couple cuts up here in the high range as well. And then a high cut and a low cut as well, just to make sure there's no super low rumble or excessive high frequencies at the very, very top. Okay, so that is what I'm doing there. I'm just trying to shape the vocal and have it fit well and make it sit well in the context of everything else that is happening. Okay, now the next plugin is another instance of the fat channel, and in this case, I'm just using another compressor. Now this is like my standard approach. I'll start with an aggressive 1176 style compressor, which is what we just talked about before, and then I might add an EQ like I did here, and then I'll be like, do I want more compression? And often I do. And then my go-to will be to not necessarily immediately add another instance of an aggressive compressor. For the second compressor, I often like to go a bit more smooth and silky and maybe a vintage compressor that just gives it a nice warm tone. And that's exactly what this compressor does here inside the fat channel. So,
like I only go backwards, baby. Every part of me says.
now, it did turn the volume up a little bit more than you would like when you're being a compressor, but the main thing that is happening here, again, it's very subtle. We're not doing anything crazy, but these things compound and we're slowly building up. So we're just doing like 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction.
Let's go ahead.
It's not doing much. We're just kissing that vocal a little bit. So that is the first level, EQ compression, right? Now let's add in a little saturation. The majority of the vocal mixes, if you're doing anything in pop, rock, alternative, almost any genre really, your vocal can probably benefit from some saturation. And that is exactly what we have here. Now, I just happen to use Ozone 9 because I love the library or the options of the different saturation modes here with tapes and tubes and triodes and retro and analog. It sounds awesome here in Ozone, even though Ozone is typically marketed as a mastering suite, which I do use it for mastering as well. But in this case, I used it on an individual track, but just for the saturation aspect. So here is what it sounds like if I really crank this.
It feels like I only go backwards, baby. Every part of me says go ahead. I got my hopes up, but
now, as you can hear when I turn it off and on after I turn everything down, you're not hearing that much. This is very subtle again, but we're just trying to start to make sure that everything is in a good place before we add the truly transformational effects like reverbs and delays, okay? Now, I'm just gonna skim through the next few because these are very just specific to this specific vocal and this song. So I added another instance of a de-esser. The first instance didn't quite give me enough, and then I added some EQ again, just a new instance. Notice how I'm adding a new instance of the plugin, like a de-esser, a new instance of EQ. I'm just adding it to the chain. And I'm doing that, I think that's preferable than going back up the chain and editing this EQ that we already did, because I liked what I did, but then as I added more plugins, my perceptions or what I was hearing shifted, or I just wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction. I can still leave everything the same as it was up to this point. I can just add a new instance of that plugin like this EQ. So that is how I like to work, and I actually recommend that for you as well, rather than always going way back in the chain, because then that messes it. That could potentially mess things up downstream. So, and then finally, sausage fattener, just for another layer of saturation. It's very subtle again, just a little bit of the color knob, which helps on the high end.
again, oh no.
Right, so we got that.
Feels like we only go backwards, darling.
And then finally, I added just another compressor. So I went back and used another instance of the 1176 style compressor here in Studio One. And
I know that you
This time it's not compressing it quite as hard as the first one was, but I just felt like I wanted an even more of a compression bite on this vocal. And I felt free to do that really because this particular genre and this style, you can usually go a little bit crazy with things like distortion and compression and just kind of ruin the sound a little bit, as I like to say. And that, of course, applies to reverbs and delays, which we will get into. Now, before we dive into the reverbs and delays, especially the EQ, if you have trouble with trying to understand EQ specifically for vocals, then I've got the perfect guide. It is a visual guide for fixing vocal EQ problems. It's 100% free. I'll leave a link in the description below. What this gives you is a set of problems and then the solution to those EQ problems. These are the common problems we all run into, like the vocal's too muddy, it's not bright enough, it's not cutting through the mix enough, it's too harsh, and I give you visual examples of a real EQ and show you approximately what that cut or boost can look like, and it'll give you a good action plan moving forward when it comes to using EQ effectively on your vocals, okay? So I'll leave a link again in the description below if you want to check that out. All right, now let's move on to the fun part, which is the reverbs and the delays. Now, I actually talked about this briefly in last week's video, which was the 10 reverb types for music production. And this was number 10 on the list, which was the psychedelic reverb. And there I gave you an outline of the 3-step process, or the 3 stacked reverb system, if you will. Because here's the thing about this kind of psychedelic sound. I found it's pretty difficult to get a precise psychedelic sound the way that I want to hear it using only one reverb or one delay with reverb on it, because it just seems to work better when we attack the vocal and we hit it from 2 or 3 angles. So that's exactly what I'm going to show you here. So you could use this as a base template, as a way to kind of get you going, and I'm going to give that to you here, which this 3-part system is: number 1 is the flange reverb, number 2 is the spacious reverb, and then number 3 is the slap delay with modulation. Okay, so these are 3 separate channels, and for all 3 of these, I have them set up on return tracks. I'm a big fan of using return tracks rather than putting reverbs directly on the tracks themselves. Now, if that's confusing, I have another video on my channel called Inserts versus Return Tracks, which is best. So I'll try to remember to leave a link, but if I don't remember, then you can of course just go and search that on my YouTube channel. So let's start with the flange verb, which is here. I'm going to turn that on and I'm going to show you what that sounds like. There's without it. Okay, we're starting to get the effect immediately, right? Notice how when we were working on the EQ compression and things of that nature, it was more subtlety, it was more nuanced. Here, we are just going crazy. And that's what makes this part so fun, is you hear the contrast. It's such a drastic shift and such an obvious change to the sound. And those, in my opinion, are the most fun effects to work with. So this is the flange reverb. Now, why do I call this the flange reverb? Well, that is because there is a flanger on the reverb signal itself. So again, we're on a return track and we're sending the vocal, or you could say we're sending a copy of the vocal through this flange reverb on this return track over here. The lead vocal is over here, and I'm sending it under sends to this flange reverb. Now, the first plugin is Valhalla Vintage Verb. That's just my go-to reverb plugin. Use whatever reverb you're comfortable with and that you like. This is just my default. And as per usual, I started with a preset, landed on one that I thought sounded great, and then made adjustments to taste from there. So here's what it sounds like without the other plugins in this chain. And then we are adding the flanger to this. Now this, as you'll notice, I'm going to crank this a little bit so you can really hear it. And I think when you hear this, you'll be like, ah, that is a little bit of that Tame Impala flair to this. Listen. That phasiness, right? That flangey, phasey sound, which Tame Impala is famous for. This is one of the ways that you can achieve that you can layer it in, is by not necessarily putting it on the lead vocal, but putting it on the reverb signal that we're sending the lead vocal through. Okay, so I have the mix close to halfway, and that sounded good to me. So after that, we're just using the Abbey Road technique on this reverb. rolling off the lows to get rid of low end we don't need, and the highs to kind of give a nice blanket effect over this reverb sound so it's not too bright and harsh. So here's what it sounds like. Do you notice not only the super high ends get warmed up, but man, that low end, right? It's a lot of build up, but then when we roll all that off here, now, of course, I have this cranked still, so that's why this reverb is extra loud. So let's bring that down to more reasonable volume. And then finally, the last plugin in this chain is just a plugin to adjust the stereo width. So in this case, I just thought I wanted to make it not completely mono, but just a little bit less stereo and a bit more of a focused tone to this reverb sound. So then I just did this. Let's come back here. There's wide. I didn't want it completely mono, so I settled for about 65% width or so. So there you go. That is the flange reverb, which is the first layer or the first instance of a reverb that we're using. That is the first attack point, and then I don't know why I'm using like a war term to like attack the vocal, but anyway, that is the first attack point, and then we are going to use 2 more attack points using the spacious reverb and then the slapback delay with modulation. Now the spacious reverb, also in this session, it's just called the tape reverb, but functionally it is all about adding more just space to this vocal sound. So listen to what it sounds like when we turn this on. So I'm going to turn off the flange verb for now. That way we can hear this tape reverb, this spacious reverb in isolation. Sounds like this. So you're very ambient, very spread out, this time super stereo, super spacious. And what's interesting, as you see here, is I'm actually getting this effect inside of a delay plugin. So this is Valhalla Delay, and this is just by accident. I was scrolling through these presets. I was likely just looking for potentially delay effects I could add to it, and I stumbled across this preset and I was like, this sounds great. And the reason it sounds like a reverb is because it's completely drenched in this diffusion, which is like a reverb setting inside of this delay plugin. And then I may have made slight adjustments. Now, a key thing that you hear with this delay is that ducking effect. And that's really cool because if I turn it completely up, then you lose basically all of the sound because it ducks it completely out of the way. But this responds, it becomes very transparent, and it reacts against the lead vocal that is feeding into this delay, and it ducks that delay whenever the lead vocal is present. So it kind of creates more space for the lead, and it's just, I love the ducking feature here inside of this Valhalla Delay plugin. But again, that's the spacious reverb. I stumbled across a preset and a sound that I liked using a plugin that I wasn't expecting to get that type of sound, and voila, there it was. So, you know, there's not a precise rhyme or reason to everything I'm doing. A lot of it is just you're stumbling around, you're experimenting, and then you keep what sticks, right? And then I'm also using the Pancake plugin here on this tape reverb. And what that's doing is it's taking that reverb signal and it's swimming it around in the stereo field. So you can hear it panning from left to right, and it has a bit of that effect. Listen. That's if it's turned all the way up, so I just didn't want it quite that extreme. So. And that's just another example of just really leaning into this psychedelic Tame Impala style sound. We're using phasers or flangers or choruses, and then we're using some pans, some auto pan techniques here, where the sound's swimming around, the effect's swimming around, and all of those things compile to build up that really psychedelic experience inside of a song. So those are the first two. Let's now listen to the flange verb and this tape reverb together. Backwards, baby. Now, that sounds good, right? We're close to the finish line here, but listen to what this third effect adds. Number 3 here, which is the slapback delay with modulation. I want you to listen to the effect that this has on this vocal because it is incredible. Listen to this. It feels like I only go backwards, baby. it just adds all of that flutteriness, slapback delay with like a bunch of modulation on it, and it's just incredible for this specific type of genre. So what we're doing here, Valhalla delay, starting it from a slap delay bass line, and then from there we are running it through some modulation. So I've got the depth here in the mod section of this delay plugin at like 66%, so it's really making that sound. It's really giving that delay signal a lot of flutteriness and flanginess to the sound. Now, if your delay plugin that you're using doesn't have that modulation built into it, well then you can just, because you're using return tracks like I'm teaching you and like I often recommend you to do here, you can just add a plugin after the delay, like a chorus or a flanger or a phaser. Just experiment with different type of modulating effects like that, and you can get a sound that sounds kind of like this. And then finally, I did want to make that sound, that slap delay sound, almost mono. Again, we're not going completely mono, but pretty close. Has that tunnel effect. It's right down the middle, and it allows the instrumentation and all the stereo elements to shine a bit more, and that slap delay doesn't run over everything. Okay, so that is the 3-part system for this type of Tame Impala reverb. Now, just a couple more quick details when it comes to reverbs and delays is this quarter note delay and then this delay throw. So let's start with the quarter note delay, which that is just an overall delay that is here from start to finish. Just a very basic quarter note delay using modulation on this one as well. So we're creating just on a lot of these tracks, just really trying to phase it out, flange it out, add modulation. So, and then we've got the low cut, high cut, pretty drastic on the Abbey Road technique there. And that's the effect, just one plugin on that quarter note delay. And then we've got a delay throw, which you hear over here. So it's this part. Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn down that quarter note delay. Let's turn that back down, and then let's come over here again. Hear that delay throw on just the 2 words, my name, and it's automated. It's nowhere else in this remake of, or at least not in my version of the song. That is the only place you hear it. And as you can hear, it's pan to the left. That's because we got the pan here, about 50 left here inside of this return track. And then Valhalla delay, again, I just adjusted the delay. In this case, I went in and manually adjusted the milliseconds because I was having trouble having it sit right when I would use the note setting here, which adapts it to whatever the tempo of the song is, and it just wasn't fitting in the right pocket, so I went manually in and adjusted the millisecond on this delay time until I got it to sound right, and then some reverb to run that delay signal through, so we add some extra ambience to that delay signal itself. So one more time. I love the sound of a good delay throw, like we have here. Just nice little ear candy effects, right? Just like we did here. It's the same type of, I mean, not the same, but it adds a similar effect to here. Speaking of that, let's actually talk about that now, because we're done with the reverbs and delays. And before we get into these background vocals here, very quickly, let me just share what exactly I did with this. Now, of course, originally, this was on the regular lead vocal track, but then it ended up on its own track. And just because, obviously, that's what happens on the original, so I was inspired to add that in here. But isn't that nice? That contrast. It's such an ear candy component, and I absolutely love it. So we've got the auto-tune, we've got the Ozone 9, and again, I'm using Ozone just for the saturation, the distortion effect, and I really cranked it. In this case, I think you used the tube distortion there. And then JJP vocals just for an all-in-one processing. And then we've got EQ to just make that track fit better and cut away some high end so it filters out and juxtaposes against the normal lead vocal track, right? And then we're sending this to a lot of the same reverbs and delays that the lead vocal is being sent to, like the flange verb etc., etc. Now, there's one more instance where we are using this effect as well. It's just a beautiful little detail. It's these little details that can just really elevate your song out of the crowd and out of the mud where all the other songs live. These little details make such a difference. All right, so that is that track. And now to wrap this up, let's just talk real quick about these 4 background vocal tracks. Now, first of all, I want you to take a look at this. Before you listen to it, just visually take a step back, look at this arrangement. Notice how sparse the background vocals are. They're not there the whole time. And that is what makes them so powerful, right? Listen to how the vocal starts. It's just the one lead vocal, but then those backgrounds come in and out. Listen.
It feels like I only go backwards, baby. Every part of me says go ahead.
Now, listen to this. Now, isn't that cool? So we're taking the listener on a journey. So when you're making these decisions, right? Notice how here we've got both left and right. We got 2 background vocal tracks, 1 pan left, 1 pan right, and we're repeating the same basic line.
Baby, baby, every part of me says go.
Now, do I want... Okay, let me turn on the reverb so it actually sounds more like what it did sound like before. And then notice how that is on the left, and then over here it's on the right. And then it goes into that, right? Just constantly changing. You're never stuck in a monotonous type of sound. You're always throwing little details here, and that is what makes these background vocals so powerful. It's because they're not there the whole time. You're really picking your spots. And then over here, it's the same type of thing. Left and right, doubles, and then here, we've got a stack of 4. So this is the one time where I layered in 4 takes. And just spread them panning wise across the stereo field, and then finally at the end here. Now, as you can hear, these are processed pretty crazily as well, just like the lead vocal is. And when it comes to that, I ended up just grouping all 4, sending them all through this background vocals bus. There's nothing on the individual tracks as far as plugins. And then I'm using JJP vocals, which if you know me, you know I love using this on background vocals or anything where I don't really care that much. It's maybe tucked in the back, or I just want a quick processing on the vocal. And that's what we have there. And then I'm running all those tracks through this chorus. So that's where you get that sort of modulated effect, and then EQ to make the background vocals just sit better and sit underneath the mix. That's why you have this huge cut in the 2K range. It's to make the background vocals to kind of get out of the way a bit of the lead vocals and to just play that supportive role. And finally, we're sending those again to the same types of reverbs and delays. Flange reverb, quarter note delay, tape reverb. Just another case and another instance of why it's so recommended for you to use your reverbs and delays on return tracks, because you can reuse them for different tracks across your session without having to repeat the same effects.
It feels like